married for 50 years, half a century of sweat, loyalty, and building a life from the ground up. I was left with nothing, betrayed, and thrown away by the very people I bled for. Just when I thought I was going to die, a forgotten, broke old man in the freezing rain, I stumbled upon a secret house no one knew about. A $25 million hidden fortress that changed my life and gave me the ultimate revenge. It is 11 at night. The Seattle rain is coming down in heavy freezing sheets, cold and completely unforgiving. I am 79 years old. I am standing on the front porch of a $3 million estate. My estate, the one I built with my own 2 hands. The porch light is off, leaving me completely in the dark. My clothes are soaked through to my bones. The chill is creeping into my joints, making my chest ache with every breath I take. At my feet sits a single cheap black trash bag. Inside that bag are 2 pairs of old pants, a few wrinkled shirts, and my shaving kit. That is all I have left in this entire world. I press my face against the cold glass of the large front window. Inside the living room is bathed in warm golden light. The fireplace is roaring cheerfully. I laid every single brick of that fireplace myself 30 years ago, working late into the night so my family would always be warm. Sitting on the expensive leather sofa is Martha, my wife of 50 years. She is wearing a silk robe I bought for her just last Christmas. Next to her is my 48-year-old son Jason and his wife Rachel. They are not arguing. They are not frantically looking for me. They are holding crystal glasses filled with expensive champagne. They are here to make sure I do not break the glass. "Mr. Caldwell, you need to step away from the door," the younger officer says. His voice is loud enough to be heard over the pouring rain, but there is a distinct trace of pity in it. I look back at him. My hands are shaking, not just from the freezing cold, but from a shock so deep it feels like my heart has stopped beating. These hands are covered in thick white scars from 40 years of pouring concrete and building commercial towers for this city. I worked 80-hour weeks so my son would never know what it feels like to be hungry. I sacrificed my own health to build an empire for my family. And now I cannot even step inside my own foyer to get out of the storm. He opens it and shines his heavy flashlight on a stack of legal documents. "I am very sorry, sir," the officer says softly. "We ran the property records just like your son requested when he called us. Your name is not on the deed. The property is legally owned by a private trust controlled by Jason Caldwell and Martha Caldwell. You have no legal right to enter these premises. If you try to force your way in, your son has made it clear he wants to press charges for trespassing." Trespassing. The word hits me like a physical blow to the stomach. It knocks the wind right out of me. I turn my head and look through the window one last time. Jason has stood up. He walks casually over to the glass. He is still holding his champagne glass. He looks right at me standing out there in the miserable rain with the police. I am left alone in the dark. "You need to gather your belongings and leave the property." "Mr. Caldwell," the younger officer says, stepping closer to make sure I comply. "We can drop you off at a shelter downtown if you need a ride, but you cannot stay here." I look down at my calloused hands. The betrayal is so absolute, so vicious, that I do not even have tears left to cry. My own wife, my own son, they did not just kick me out in a moment of anger. They planned this. They waited for a night when the weather was brutal. They waited until they had legally drained every ounce of power I had. I reach down and pick up the black trash bag. My joints were a little stiff, a reminder of decades spent climbing steel scaffolding and hauling concrete blocks. But I felt good. I felt secure. I reached for a new coffee filter and tossed the plastic wrapping into the stainless steel trash can next to the island. That is when I saw it, a crumpled piece of paper sitting right on top of the coffee grounds from the day before. Now, I am not a man who makes a habit of digging through the garbage, but something about the thick, official-looking bank paper caught my eye. It was not a grocery receipt. She looked perfectly serene wearing her silk bathrobe, her hair neatly brushed. She smiled at me, a warm, familiar smile that I had trusted for 50 years. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, walking past me to get her favorite ceramic mug. I did not say good morning back. I held up the crumpled bank receipt. My hand was shaking slightly. "Martha," I said, my voice tight, "what is this? Why is there a wire transfer for $500,000 to Jason's business account?" "I found it in the trash." The silence in the kitchen stretched out heavy and suffocating. The coffee machine beeped softly behind me, signaling that the pot was ready, but neither of us moved. The smell of the dark roast, which usually brought me so much comfort, suddenly made my stomach churn. Martha stopped. She did not look panicked. She did not drop her mug. Instead, her smile softened into a look of gentle, almost condescending pity. She poured her coffee, took a slow sip, and leaned against the counter. "Oh, Harrison," she sighed, shaking her head slightly. "We talked about this, do you not remember?" I stared at her, completely stunned. "Talked about this, you what?" Echoed, my voice rising in disbelief. "When did we talk about giving our son $500,000? I looked down at the receipt again, my thumb brushing over the printed numbers. 50 years of marriage, 50 years of sharing everything, trusting her implicitly with my life and my livelihood, and she was standing there lying to my face, without batting an eye. The absolute audacity of it left me completely breathless. Martha walked over and placed a comforting hand on my arm. I flinched, but she kept it there, patting me gently, like a confused child. "Last week, Harrison," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Jason is closing a massive commercial deal downtown. The financing got delayed by a few days because of some paperwork red tape. He just needed a temporary bridge loan to secure the property until the bank funds clear next week. He will pay it right back. You told him it was a great idea. You really are getting forgetful lately. Honey, maybe we should schedule an appointment with Dr. Evans." She was watching me closely, waiting to see if I would swallow the bait. If I had been a retired school teacher or an accountant, maybe I would have believed her. But I spent my entire life reading structural weaknesses. When a foundation is cracked, you cannot hide it with a fresh coat of paint. My gut was screaming at me. This was no bridge loan. This was theft. I needed to know the truth. She kissed my cheek and told me she would be back by noon to make a nice roast for lunch. I told her to have a wonderful time and watched through the front window as she backed her car out of the driveway. The moment her taillights disappeared, the charade was completely over. I walked directly into my home office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The house was completely silent. It was that thick, heavy kind of silence that happens right before a storm breaks. I sat down at my desk and pulled out my personal address book. I found the direct line for Richard Sterling. I could hear the faint sound of his children playing in the background. "Harrison," he said, his voice carrying a mix of warmth and professional curiosity. "It is good to hear from you. I hope everything is all right." I did not waste any time with pleasantries. The time for polite conversation was over. "Richard," I said, keeping my voice low and level, "I need you to pull up my joint retirement portfolio right now. I need a complete verbal audit of every transaction made in the last 90 days. And I need to know the exact current balance to the penny." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The sound of the children playing in the background was suddenly muffled. "Harrison?" He started, his tone shifting from friendly to extremely cautious. "Are you sure you need me to do this right now? I thought we were all clear on the transition strategy. I have been sending the monthly statements directly to Jason, just as requested." My blood ran completely cold. The temperature in my home office seemed to drop 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. Transition strategy statements sent to Jason. I closed my eyes and gripped the edge of my mahogany desk, so hard my knuckles turned white. "Richard," I said, forcing the words out through a tight throat. "Just open the file and read me the balance." I heard the faint clicking of a computer keyboard. It felt like every keystroke was a nail being driven into a coffin. He hesitated, clearly sensing the panic rising in the silence. It was transferred out in a series of 6-wire movements over the last 3 months. He explained, his professional demeanor slipping into genuine concern. All of the funds were moved into the corporate accounts of Jason Caldwell Real Estate Holdings. "Harrison, first I have to ask, is everything all right? You authorized these transfers." I leaned back in my leather chair, staring blankly at the ceiling. "Martha, he secretly used medical documents to rob me completely blind." I hung up the phone without saying another word to Richard. The heavy brass receiver slipped from my trembling fingers and clattered onto the plastic base. My home office, usually a sanctuary of quiet reflection and peace, suddenly felt like a prison cell shrinking around me. My own flesh and blood, my only son, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball in the backyard, the boy I had paid to put through an expensive private college, had completely destroyed my life, and he had used my own fatherly trust as the ultimate weapon. Across the top in bold black letters it read, General Durable Power of Attorney. Seeing those printed words sent a fresh cold wave of nausea washing directly over me. The memory of signing this very document came rushing back to my mind. 2 years ago, I had a terrifying minor scare. My doctor found a slight blockage in one of my arteries and strongly recommended a routine stent procedure. It was a simple low-risk surgery, but at 77 years old, anytime you go under heavy anesthesia, there is always a small, lingering shadow of doubt. Jason had come over to the house the night before the scheduled surgery. He looked so genuinely worried about my health. He held my hand tightly, looked me right in the eyes, and told me how much he loved me. I kept digging through the red folder, my rising panic rapidly turning into a cold, hard rage. If Jason had successfully used this document to drain the bank accounts, what else had he secretly done? I found another thick envelope from the county recorder office dated exactly 3 weeks ago. I ripped it open instantly. It was a property deed, but it was not the original deed I had signed 30 years ago when I built this beautiful house. It was a brand new transfer of title. According to this stamped piece of paper, Harrison Caldwell had legally gifted the $3 million property to the Caldwell Family Private Trust. And the sole acting trustees listed clearly on the document were Jason Caldwell and Martha Caldwell. All that remained in my chest was a burning, white-hot anger. I stepped out into the wide sunlit hallway, listening to the heavy oak front door swing open. The sound of cheerful laughter echoed through the foyer. It was Martha, my loving wife, returning from her Sunday service, accompanied by Jason and his wife Rachel. They were casually discussing where to make dinner reservations, their voices light and carefree. I listened to the clatter of Martha hanging up her coat, the sound of Jason tossing his expensive car keys onto the silver entryway tray. It was a perfectly normal, mundane domestic scene, but to me, listening from the shadows of the hallway, it sounded like a pack of wolves returning to the den after slaughtering the sheep. Jason looked up from his phone, raising an eyebrow in mild surprise. "Hey, Dad," he said, his tone entirely casual. "Mom said you were taking it easy today. You feeling all right? You look a little pale." I did not say a word. I walked slowly and deliberately over to the heavy glass coffee table in the center of the room. I raised my hand and slammed the thick stack of printed bank statements and the forged property deed down onto the glass surface. The loud smack echoed sharply across the room, cutting their cheerful banter dead in the air. Rachel gasped slightly, taking a step back. "I want my money back," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, devoid of any shouting or hysteria. It was the voice of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "I want the $2.5 million you stole from my retirement account. And I want the deed to this house restored to my name by tomorrow morning." For a moment, nobody moved. The silence in the living room was absolute, suffocating, and thick. I watched the fake loving smile slowly melt right off Martha's face. The transformation was truly terrifying to witness. The sweet church-going woman I had kissed goodbye just a few hours ago completely vanished. In her place stood a cold, hard, calculating stranger. She did not look guilty. She did not look ashamed. He stepped forward, putting his hands in his pockets, adopting the arrogant posture of a corporate executive, dealing with a disgruntled employee. "Look, Dad, let us not be dramatic," he said, rolling his eyes. "Nobody stole anything. You signed the power of attorney. You gave me legal authority to manage the family assets. I am simply restructuring our financial portfolio to maximize returns for the estate. You should be thanking me. You do not understand how modern real estate investing works." I stepped closer to him, my fists clenched so tight, my fingernails dug painfully into my palms. "Do not insult my intelligence," I whispered. "You used a medical proxy I signed before a heart surgery to quietly drain every single penny I worked 40 years to save. You transferred my home into a private trust. You robbed your own father blind." Martha finally spoke. Her voice was like crushed ice, devoid of any warmth or affection. "Oh, stop your pathetic whining, Harrison," she snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. You have always been so utterly obsessed with your money. You have lived your entire life like a paranoid miser. Jason needed capital for his business. You have been on millions of dollars doing absolutely nothing with it, just watching it gather dust in a bank account while your son struggled to grow his company. You have lived long enough. It is his turn now. I stared at her, my heart breaking into a million irreparable pieces. 50 years, Martha, I said, my voice cracking despite my best efforts to stay strong. I gave you 50 years of my life. She looked me right in the eyes, her expression completely flat. Because I am tired of you, Harrison, she said smoothly, without a single ounce of hesitation. I am tired of your boring routines, your cheap habits, and your constant need for control. In fact, since you've already figured it out, I might as well save us the trouble of pretending. I filed the divorce papers first thing yesterday morning. My lawyer will be contacting you next week, but honestly, there is nothing left for you to fight over. The assets are protected. You do not own anything anymore. The sheer brutality of her words hit me like a physical blow. Divorce. The assets are protected. She had planned every single detail of my financial execution. Jason let out a short, cruel laugh. Let us face reality, Dad, he sneered, his face twisting into an ugly expression of pure contempt. You are a useless old dinosaur. You belong to a different era. You spent your whole life pouring concrete like a mindless laborer. You do not understand high-level finance. I am taking the family legacy to the next level. You were just in the way. It is time for you to step aside and let the adults handle the real business. I felt a surge of adrenaline flood my system. I raised my hand and pointed a trembling finger right at his face. Get out, I roared, the anger finally boiling over. Both of you, get out of my house right now. Jason just smirked. He reached into his tailored jacket and pulled out his cell phone. It is not your house anymore, old man, he said coldly. He dialed a number and held the phone to his ear, never breaking eye contact with me. Yes, neighborhood security, and I would like you to dispatch the local police as well. I have a hostile trespasser refusing to leave my private property. Yes, my father, he is becoming aggressive, and I fear for the safety of my wife and mother. I stood there completely paralyzed by the sheer sociopathic ease with which he lied. Rachel walked over to the wet bar and calmly began pouring 3 glasses of expensive champagne, completely ignoring my presence. Martha turned her back to me and sat down on the leather sofa, adjusting her silk robe. They were treating me like an unwanted stray dog that had wandered into their pristine living room. Within 10 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the large front window. The rain had started to fall outside, heavy and cold. The officers knocked on the door, and Jason let them in, playing the role of the concerned patient son dealing with a confused, angry elder. He showed them the trust documents. He swiped it through the machine. It beeped an angry flat tone. Declined, he said, not even looking up. I frowned, my hands shaking from the cold, and handed him another card. A gold rewards card I had used for 20 years. He swiped it. Declined again, sir, the clerk said with deep impatience. Do you have a card that actually works, or do you have cash? A cold knot tightened in the pit of my stomach. Jason had not just drained the bank accounts and stolen the house. With that power of attorney, he had completely shut down every single line of credit I possessed. He intentionally cut off my resources, ensuring I could not hire a lawyer or buy a warm meal. He wanted me completely helpless. I dug into the hidden compartment of my wallet and pulled out a $50 bill I always kept for emergencies. I slid it under the glass. The clerk handed me a heavy metal key attached to a cheap plastic tag. Room 114, he muttered, pointing toward the back. The motel room was small and smelled faintly of stale cigarette smoke and cheap cleaning chemicals. The carpet was stained, and the thin bedspread looked like it had not been washed in months. I dropped my trash bag onto the floor and sat heavily on the edge of the mattress. The springs groaned loudly beneath my weight. I was 79 years old. Yesterday I was a wealthy, respected, retired builder enjoying the fruits of a lifetime of hard labor. Tonight I sat in a roadside motel room shivering in wet clothes completely alone. I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket. Every birthday, every Christmas, every vacation now felt like a carefully orchestrated lie. The emotional pain was so severe it manifested as a sharp ache in the center of my chest. For a terrifying moment, I wondered if my old heart was finally giving out. Maybe this was exactly what Jason and Martha were hoping for. Maybe they were banking on the stress and the cold finally killing me off, tying up their single loose end perfectly. If I died in this cheap motel room, they would not even have to pay for a funeral. They would just sweep my ashes under the rug and move into their wealthy lives without a second thought. I sat there in the dark for hours, letting the grief wash over me in agonizing waves. I stared at it, my heart suddenly beating a little faster. Sitting perfectly preserved inside that shallow concealed space was a thick, dusty manila envelope. I had owned that box for over 50 years, and I had absolutely no idea this compartment even existed. My father must have built it himself. I carefully reached down and pulled the envelope free. The paper was dry and brittle, yellowed with age. The metal clasp at the top was slightly rusted, but it opened with a soft snap. I turned the envelope upside down and let the contents slide out onto the ugly patterned carpet of the motel room. Because I was young and trying to protect my new business assets from liability, I created a shell company, an anonymous LLC, to hold the deed. Over the years, I just forgot about it. I never even told Martha about the purchase because, frankly, it was just a worthless patch of dirt in the middle of nowhere, and the business was growing so fast that 200 acres of rocks completely slipped my mind. Then another memory surfaced, sharp and clear. About 20 years ago, I received a strange letter at my construction office. It was from a highly eccentric tech billionaire, a man who had made a fortune in early software and wanted to completely disappear from society. He had somehow tracked down the ownership of that LLC. He wanted to lease my isolated mountain property to build a private off-grid retreat. I looked down at the heavy brass key resting on the carpet. A strange, powerful sense of purpose began to fill my chest, pushing away the cold despair that had almost destroyed me just an hour ago. I was completely broke in Seattle, but I held the deed to a hidden empire in Colorado. I carefully gathered the documents, placed them back inside the manila envelope, and clutched it tightly against my chest. I finally knew exactly what I had to do next. The game was far from over, and I would win. I left the motel before the sun even thought about rising. The Seattle rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a bitter, damp cold that seeped right through my thin jacket. At 79 years old, sitting in a worn-out driver's seat with broken springs is pure agony. The constant vibration of the highway radiated up through the floorboards, settling deep into my arthritic knees and lower back. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but I refused to pull over. I drove through the endless pine forests of Washington, crossing over the border into the sprawling, empty plains of Idaho. The landscape blurred past my window, matching the chaotic swirl of thoughts in my head. I tried to focus on the road, but the silence inside the cabin was deafening. My mind kept drifting back to Jason and Martha. I pictured them sitting in my warm living room, drinking my expensive wine, laughing about how easily they had discarded me. If I arrived in Aspen and found nothing but 200 acres of frozen dirt and dead trees, it would truly be the end. I would freeze to death in the cab of this truck, entirely alone, thousands of miles away from anyone who even cared to know my name. The fear was paralyzing. It wrapped around my throat like a heavy iron chain. But when morning finally broke, bringing a pale, weak light over the frozen fields, I sat up. I looked at the wooden box resting on the passenger seat. I had absolutely nothing left to lose. I turned the key, forced the stiff gear shift into drive, and merged back onto the highway. The second day was a steep climb into the unforgiving heartland of the Rocky Mountains. Every jarring bump sent a fresh spike of pain up my spine, but I could not bring myself to slow down. The dense canopy of ancient pine trees blocked out what little remained of the evening light, plunging the forest into a deep, disorienting twilight. My headlights, weak and yellowed with age, fought a losing battle against the creeping darkness. I watched the GPS tracker on my phone screen. The small blue dot representing my truck crawled closer and closer to the red pin marking my destination. Half a mile, a quarter of a mile, 500 feet. My breathing grew shallow. I sat in the idling truck for a long moment, completely paralyzed by the sheer scale of the structure. The eccentric billionaire had not just leased my land. He had fortified it. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence of the mountain was deafening. broken only by the whistling of the freezing wind through the pines. I grabbed my flashlight and pushed the heavy truck door open. The biting cold of the aspen evening hit me instantly, slicing right through my thin jacket, but I barely felt it. I walked slowly toward the steel gate, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. It slid in smoothly. I wrapped my stiff fingers around the brass bow and turned it to the right. There was a loud, heavy metallic clank that echoed sharply through the quiet forest. Deep within the steel structure, gears began to grind. Slowly, majestically, the massive stainless steel panels began to slide apart, receding smoothly into the rock walls on either side. I stood up completely mesmerized, watching the barrier disappear. The path was open. I hurried back to the truck, my fatigue instantly evaporating, replaced by a massive surge of pure adrenaline. The billionaire had poured his massive fortune into creating an isolated paradise on the exact plot of dirt I had bought for pennies 4 decades ago. And now, as I stood there in my wet clothes and worn-out shoes, staring at the breathtaking mansion, glowing faintly in the mountain twilight, the reality of my situation finally crashed over me. Jason and Martha had thrown me into the street to steal $2 million. They had no idea I was holding the key to an empire. I pushed open the heavy walnut doors and stepped across the threshold. Instantly, I was enveloped in a wave of deep, comforting warmth. The mansion was completely off the grid, powered by the massive solar arrays I had seen on the roof, but it felt as alive as any home I had ever built. Soft ambient lighting automatically hummed to life as I walked into the grand foyer, illuminating the rich natural stone floors and the towering walls of glass that looked out over the darkened valley. I walked over and sat down in the heavy leather executive chair. The leather creaked softly in the quiet room. Sitting perfectly centered on the immaculate desk was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was sealed with a dark red wax stamp. Written across the front in elegant fountain pen script were 3 words, "To the landowner." My hands trembled as I reached out and picked up the envelope. The paper felt thick and expensive. I broke the wax seal and pulled out a single handwritten letter, along with a thick stack of legal documents bound by a heavy silver clip. I unfolded the letter and began to read. The handwriting belonged to the eccentric tech billionaire who had leased my land 20 years ago. The letter was dated exactly 1 year prior. He wrote that his health was failing rapidly and his doctors had given him only a few months to live. He explained that he had no family, no heirs, and absolutely no desire to leave his beloved mountain retreat to a greedy corporate trust or a squabbling board of directors. The receipt was stamped legally binding and completely paid in full. There were no hidden fees, there were no mortgages, there were no liens. The property was free and clear. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and stared up at the high vaulted ceiling of the office. A strange booming sound echoed through the room. It took me a moment to realize it was the sound of my own laughter. I spent the rest of that first night exploring every inch of my new fortress. The billionaire had thought of absolutely everything. In the lower level of the mansion, behind a steel door disguised as a wine rack, I found the emergency room. It was stocked with freeze-dried food, medical supplies, and advanced communication equipment. But what truly mattered was sitting in a heavy floor, safe bolted to the concrete foundation. The code had been written on the back of the tax document I found in the office. I punched in the numbers and pulled the heavy door open. Inside, stacked in neat vacuum-sealed plastic bags, was exactly $100 in unmarked, untraceable $20 and $50 bills. I told him I was a wealthy investor representing an anonymous limited liability company, and I needed an immediate devastating forensic audit of a Seattle-based real estate firm. I told him I had a retainer of $50,000 in cash, ready to be overnighted to his office trust via a private courier service from Colorado. Benjamin was a man who respected power and liquidity. He agreed instantly. I drove the briefcase down the mountain to a private shipping facility and sent the money. The trap was officially set. By the end of the week, I transformed the mahogany office into my personal command center. I had 3 large computer monitors set up on the heavy wooden desk, all connected to the secure, high-speed satellite that powered the estate. Benjamin hated sloppy, arrogant criminals, and he loved taking them apart piece by piece. "Mr. Caldwell," Benjamin said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the high-fidelity speakers of the mansion. "I have my team of forensic accountants digging through every public record, tax filing, and corporate shell associated with your son's company. Jason Caldwell Real Estate Holdings is a fascinating puzzle, but it is not a successful business. It is a house of cards waiting for a strong wind." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the mahogany desk. "Tell me everything," I instructed, my voice hard and entirely devoid of any fatherly affection. Benjamin began pulling up spreadsheets and graphs, sharing his screen so I could see the exact anatomy of my son's impending ruin. Jason had been playing the role of the hotshot wealthy developer for years, but it was all smoke and mirrors. He took out massive high-interest loans from predatory firms to fund a lifestyle he could not actually afford. The luxury cars, the expensive country club memberships, the lavish vacations Martha and Rachel constantly bragged about, all of it was financed by dangerous, toxic debt. Jason was bleeding money from every single corporate pore. I watched the red numbers scroll across my screen, representing tens of millions of dollars in outstanding liabilities. A strange mixture of disgust and satisfaction washed over me. Benjamin smiled thinly through the camera. "Your son is backed into a very dark corner, Harrison," he said smoothly. "He has liquidated every liquid asset he possesses, including your retirement funds. He poured it all into one final gamble. Let him dig a little deeper," I replied. I leaned back in the heavy leather chair and took a slow sip of my black coffee. The bitter taste grounded me, sharpening my focus as I watched the screen. Benjamin nodded slightly, a cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard, and the complex financial spreadsheets on my monitor dissolved. In their place, a series of sleek, high-definition architectural renderings appeared. They showed a massive, sprawling luxury complex nestled against a pristine, snowy mountainside. There were grand ski lodges built with imported timber, heated outdoor pools glowing in the twilight, and a private gondola system connecting the resort directly to the highest peaks. It looked incredibly ambitious, the kind of vanity project that only a billionaire or a complete fool would attempt to build from scratch. "This is what your son has been working on for the past 3 years, Benjamin explained, his voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any emotion. "He calls it the Apex Winter Retreat," Benjamin continued. "It is a proposed $100 million luxury resort development located right here in the Aspen Valley. Jason wants to cater exclusively to the ultra-wealthy, offering private helicopter pads, exclusive ski runs, and membership fees that rival small fortunes. It is his ultimate dream, Harrison. He wants to stop being a mid-level commercial developer in Seattle and force his way into the highest echelon of global real estate tycoons. The problem is that he does not have the actual capital to do it. He has been selling a fantasy to his investors. He convinced a group of private equity firms to back the initial development phases, promising them impossible returns within an absurdly short timeline. But building a $100 million fortress in the mountains requires a massive amount of upfront cash, far more than he ever actually raised." I stared at the glossy renderings of the ski resort. He wanted to be a man who wore custom suits and sipped champagne with billionaires, but he lacked the fundamental patience and discipline required to build something real. "How short is he, Benjamin?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper in the quiet office. "The financial gap is catastrophic," Benjamin replied instantly. "The initial investor money dried up 6 months ago. The contractors threatened to walk off the site, and the local government was about to revoke his zoning permits due to lack of progress. That is when he became truly desperate." Benjamin brought up another set of documents on the screen. These were bank routing numbers, wire transfer receipts, and heavily redacted internal memos. "This is where your retirement fund comes into the picture, Harrisons," he said, leaning closer to his camera. "Jason did not just steal your $2.5 million to buy sports cars or expensive dinners for Martha and his wife. He used your entire life savings as a desperate emergency injection of capital to keep this resort project breathing. He transferred your money through 3 different corporate shell accounts to hide the origin. And then he used it to pay off the angry contractors and renew the expiring permits. He bought himself a few more months of time. He believes that if he can just finish the first phase of construction, he can secure a massive institutional loan to cover his tracks. A cold, hollow feeling settled in my chest. My son had taken the money I bled, for the money meant to secure my final years, and threw it into a burning furnace just to protect his own massive ego. He had literally gambled my life on a mountain of snow. And what happens when the money runs out again? I asked, already knowing the answer, but needing to hear Benjamin say the words aloud. Benjamin leaned back, steepled his fingers together, and looked directly into the camera lens. That is the most interesting part of this entire investigation, Harrison. If a normal business fails, the owner declares bankruptcy, liquidates the remaining assets, and walks away with a damaged reputation. But Jason did not just make bad business decisions. He actively commingled funds. He used the stolen money from your personal accounts to artificially inflate his corporate liquidity. Benjamin paused for a dramatic moment, letting the weight of his words settle over the connection. He submitted falsified financial reports to his private equity investors. Benjamin continued, his tone turning razor-sharp. He lied about his cash reserves to secure their initial millions. In the eyes of the law, that elevates this situation from a simple failed business venture to massive federal investor fraud. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not take kindly to mid-level developers lying to institutional investors. If this winter resort project stalls, if he misses even one more critical construction deadline, the investors will demand a full audit. The moment they open his books and see the fabricated numbers and the stolen family money, the federal prosecutors will step in. Jason will not just lose his company and his fancy house in Seattle. He will face a mandatory minimum of 10 years in federal prison. Federal prison, the words echoed loudly in the quiet mahogany office. Instead, I focused entirely on the fundamental bones of the project. I looked at the topographic surveys, the grading plans, and the structural foundation requirements. Jason had chosen a beautiful location, but it was a logistical nightmare. The resort was designed to sit in a steep, naturally formed bowl, high up in the mountains. It offered breathtaking panoramic views, but from an engineering perspective, it was a massive headache. I studied the elevation markers and the geological reports carefully. The northern and eastern borders of the proposed development were completely blocked by sheer, impassable granite cliffs. The western border abutted a massive tract of federally protected national forest land. The database searched for a moment before displaying the final results. The property was listed as exactly 200 acres of undeveloped alpine forest. The current owner was listed as an anonymous limited liability company. I stared at the screen, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic wild rhythm against my ribs. I knew that limited liability company. It was the exact same company charter sitting in the manila envelope on my desk. I slowly maximized the master site plan again. I superimposed the geographic coordinates of my own property directly over Jason's grand blueprint. He was completely trapped in a geographic chokehold, and I was the one holding the leash. I reached out and pressed the button to unmute my microphone. Benjamin Foster was still on the video call, watching me with a look of mild concern. "Mr. Caldwell," Benjamin said, raising an eyebrow at me, "are you feeling quite all right?" I wiped a tear of pure joy from my eye and smiled at the camera. "I am doing exceptionally well, Benjamin," I replied, my voice perfectly steady. "I just found the fatal flaw in his masterpiece." Benjamin did not waste a second after my discovery. He deployed a team of elite private investigators to monitor every move my son made. I did not just want to ruin Jason on paper. I wanted to watch his arrogant facade crumble piece by piece, exactly the way he watched me stand freezing in the rain. Through a secure digital portal Benjamin set up for me, I received daily briefings, intercepted emails, and audio transcripts of Jason's frantic phone calls. It was like watching a rat trapped in a maze that was slowly filling with water. A federal audit. Those two words were the ultimate death sentence for Jason. If they looked at his books, they would find the $2.5 million he stole from me. They would see the fabricated revenue streams. They would see the desperate illegal shell game he had been playing for the last 3 years. I listened to a recorded phone call between Jason and his lead attorney later that afternoon. Jason's voice was unrecognizable. The smooth, arrogant tone he had used to call me a useless dinosaur was gone. Marched down the driveway, completely oblivious to her husband's existential dread. She was holding a stack of glossy shopping bags from a high-end designer boutique downtown. Even through the muffled audio of the surveillance camera, I could hear the shrill, complaining tone of her voice. "Jason, my platinum credit card was declined at the jeweler today." She whined, dropping her hands to her hips in an exaggerated display of frustration. It was humiliating. The manager had to come over and take the card away. "I thought you said we transferred your father's money into the main account. Why is my card bouncing?" Jason lifted his head and stared at his wife. He looked at the expensive clothes she was wearing, the diamond rings glittering on her fingers, and the pile of luxury shopping bags she had just dumped on the driveway. He did not say a word about the investors. He did not mention the looming threat of federal prison. He did not tell her that the money he had stolen from his own father was already gone, swallowed up by the massive debt of the Aspen project. "I will fix it," Jason muttered, his voice hollow and defeated. "Just give me a few days to move some funds around." "Well, hurry up," Rachel snapped, turning on her heel and marching back toward the house. "Martha and I are supposed to go to the country club for a charity luncheon on Friday, and I refuse to show up looking like a peasant." "Fix the card, Jason." Jason stood alone in the driveway as the heavy front door slammed shut behind her. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and stared at the dark screen. He was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He had surrounded himself with greedy, shallow people who only valued him for the money he could steal. The pressure was mounting rapidly, and I knew he was about to break. It was only a matter of time before he came crawling for a desperate miracle. And when he finally reached out into the dark, I would be the one waiting to pull him under. The following morning, I sat at my mahogany desk, looking out over the snow-covered peaks of Aspen, and picked up the secure satellite phone. The phone rang only once. "Benjamin," I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "He is isolated and desperate. It is time to throw him the lifeline. Make the call." Benjamin chuckled, a low sound conveying his absolute confidence in our plan. "Consider it done, Mr. Caldwell," he replied. "I will contact his legal team within the hour. I will make sure they understand that the owner of this limited liability company is a man who does not negotiate and does not tolerate delays." I kept the audio feed open as Benjamin initiated contact, wanting to hear every word of my son's impending doom. Benjamin did not call Jason directly. Instead, he routed the call through the senior partner of the law firm representing Jason. When the senior partner answered, Benjamin introduced himself as the exclusive legal representative for the anonymous owner of the Aspen Alpine parcel. The reaction on the other end of the line was immediate and electric. The partner practically tripped over his own words desperately, trying to arrange an immediate conference call with Jason. They had hunted this ghost for weeks, and suddenly the ghost knocked on their front door. Within 10 minutes, the secure conference line was established. "He is aware that your proposed winter resort is completely landlocked without his 200 acres. You need an access road, and you made a fatal error by beginning construction before securing the geographic rights." There was a long, agonizing silence on the line. Jason had just been completely stripped of his leverage. He was exposed, yes, Jason finally admitted, his voice noticeably smaller. "We are prepared to offer your client a very generous buyout for that specific parcel. We have a valuation report that prices the raw land at approximately $2 million. That is insane. That is pure extortion. The land is just dirt and pine trees. Nobody pays $15 million for an unpermitted access corridor." "My client just did," Benjamin replied without missing a beat. "The price is $15 million, pure liquid cash. My client will not accept stock options, Caldwell." Benjamin repeated, his voice like the slam of a heavy vault door. "I strongly suggest you stop complaining and start liquidating." Good day. The line went dead. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the snow falling silently over the Aspen Valley. The bait was officially set, and the hook was massive. Jason was entirely trapped. He could not walk away from the deal. If he lost the land, the investors would audit him. The stolen retirement money would be discovered, and he would spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary. the only way to save himself from prison was to buy the land. He told his mother that this $15 million land purchase was the absolute final hurdle, the golden key that would unlock a billion-dollar valuation for his winter resort. He promised her that if they could just scrape the cash together now, they would be richer than they ever imagined. Driven by her own insatiable greed and her blind, foolish faith in her son, Martha swallowed the bait completely. She agreed to quietly sell the estate. Jason bypassed the traditional real estate market entirely to avoid any delays. He reached out to a predatory investment group. He knew the kind of corporate vultures who buy luxury properties for cash at a steep discount, provided the closing happens in a matter of days. They sold my home, the house I built brick by brick with my own hands, for a fraction of its true value, just to get the liquid capital immediately. They take it in flesh and blood. According to Benjamin's underworld contacts, Jason borrowed the remaining millions he needed directly from these men. He signed his life away on a simple piece of paper, agreeing to terms that would bankrupt a small country in mere weeks. He was so completely blinded by his own arrogance, so convinced that the Aspen resort would miraculously save him, that he willingly climbed into bed with actual monsters. He genuinely believed it was just a temporary bridge loan. He thought that once the land was his, the private equity investors would release the $100 million construction fund, and he could pay off the loan sharks before they ever came looking for him. It was a masterclass in absolute self-destruction. I sat in my quiet, warm office staring at the photographs on my monitor. His voice was trembling with a sickening mixture of exhaustion and manic triumph. "We have the funds," Jason said, practically gasping for air over the secure phone line. "The $15 million is liquid and ready for immediate transfer. We want to close this deal today. We want the deed to the Aspen property by this afternoon." Benjamin looked at me through the video feed, muttering a silent, grim confirmation. Jason had put a loaded gun directly to his own head, handed me the weapon, and begged me to pull the trigger. I did not pull it immediately. I let him sweat for another agonizing 12 hours. The final deadline was set for 5:00 in the afternoon on Friday. I woke up long before dawn. That morning, the crisp mountain air filling my lungs as I stepped out onto the glass balcony of the Aspen mansion. The world was quiet, wrapped in a blanket of fresh, untouched snow. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee and carried it into my mahogany command center. It was his entire present and his entire future completely surrendered to a faceless entity he thought he could outsmart. The moment the funds cleared the federal wire system and settled into my account, Benjamin Foster executed the next phase of our plan. He immediately filed a heavily encrypted, legally binding motion to lock the escrow account. The $15 million was instantly frozen. Jason could not pull it back. He could not reverse the wire. He was completely tethered to the trap, and the heavy iron door had just locked firmly behind him. Less than an hour after the wire transfer cleared, Jason called Benjamin's office. He felt like a titan of industry who had just navigated a massive corporate crisis. "Mr. Foster," Jason said, his voice dripping with renewed condescension over the intercepted audio feed. "The $15 million is sitting in your client's account exactly as demanded. Now my legal team has prepared the final transfer deeds for the 200 acres. You can send them over for a digital signature, but frankly, I think a transaction of this magnitude deserves a proper formal closing." Benjamin sounded mildly amused. "A formal closing? Mr. Caldwell, what exactly do you have in mind?" Jason cleared his throat, leaning into his newfound completely fabricated sense of power. "I have reserved the executive penthouse boardroom at the downtown Seattle Financial Tower for tomorrow afternoon. I will be bringing my wife Rachel and my mother Martha to celebrate the finalization of the resort expansion, and I expect your anonymous client to be there in person to sign the final paperwork. I want to meet the man I just gave $15 million to. We are neighbors now, after all. It is only fitting that we shake hands and perhaps discuss future synergies between our portfolios." I listened to his ridiculous speech and actually shook my head in absolute disbelief. He did not just want to sign the papers. He wanted a grand finale in a penthouse boardroom in the sky. "Tell him we accept," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "Tell him the owner of the limited liability company We'll be there tomorrow afternoon. Tell him to bring the champagne. Benjamin agreed and relayed the message to Jason. The excitement in Jason's voice was palpable as he confirmed the time and the address. He hung up the phone, believing he was about to step into the greatest triumph of his entire miserable life. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the heavy oak wardrobe in the master suite. I had not worn a suit since the day I retired from my construction firm. But the billionaire who owned this mansion had left behind a closet full of custom-tailored Italian suits, and ironically, we were exactly the same size. I pulled out a charcoal gray wool suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. I laid them out carefully on the massive king-sized bed. He gave me a brief approving nod, his eyes taking in my transformation. The boardroom itself was encased entirely in heavy soundproof glass, allowing me to observe the occupants inside before I made my presence known. I stood in the quiet hallway, my hands resting casually in my pockets, and watched my family celebrate their own execution. Jason was standing at the head of the massive mahogany table. He was wearing a sharp navy suit, looking every bit the arrogant corporate tycoon he desperately wanted to be. He was holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne, gesturing grandly as he spoke. Seated to his right was Martha. She was wearing a new designer dress, her hair perfectly styled, a smug, self-satisfied smile plastered across her face. The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly beautiful. Jason's eager smile froze, then twisted into an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. His eyes widened to an impossible size, darting frantically from my perfectly tailored suit to the calm, ruthless expression on my face. The muscles in his jaw went completely slack. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped right through his trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into 1,000 glittering pieces. The champagne splashed across the polished wood and soaked into the cuffs of his tailored trousers, but he did not even blink. He simply stared at me, his chest heaving as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. The old useless dinosaur he had thrown into the rain was now standing in a penthouse boardroom, wearing clothes that cost more than Jason's car, flanked by the most ruthless corporate attorney in the city. I let the silence stretch out for another 10 seconds, letting the sheer terror fully marinate in their minds. Then I rested my hands flat on the edge of the mahogany table. "Good afternoon, Jason," I said. My voice was calm, deep, and perfectly steady. It echoed loudly in the quiet glass-walled room. "I understand you have been desperately looking for me. It is a pleasure to finally do business with you." Jason finally found his voice, though it sounded like it belonged to a frightened little boy. "Dad," he stammered, his eyes darting frantically between me and the briefcase resting in Benjamin Foster's hands. "What are you doing here? Did you follow me? If you came to beg for a handout, you chose the absolute worst possible time. We are in the middle of closing a massive corporate transaction. You need to leave right now, before the owner of the land arrives. You are embarrassing me." I did not move a single inch. I simply looked at him with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. "I am not here to ask you for anything, Jason," I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy air of the boardroom. "I am here to close the transaction." I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out the original yellowed charter for the anonymous limited liability company. I tossed it casually onto the center of the massive mahogany table. It slid across the polished wood and came to a stop directly in front of Jason's trembling hands. "Read it," I commanded. Jason stared at the old document as if it were a venomous snake. He slowly reached out and turned the paper toward him. His eyes scanned the crisp black ink, tracing the name of the company and the original date of incorporation from 45 years ago. Then his eyes fell upon the signature at the very bottom of the page. It was my signature. Harrison Caldwell. The color drained from his face completely, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. "You," Jason whispered, his voice cracking violently. "I am not signing anything, Jason," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. "I am not selling you the land, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. The Aspen Estate is my new home, and I do not want a massive, noisy winter resort built in my backyard." "But the money," Jason screamed, his carefully crafted corporate persona shattering into 1,000,000 jagged pieces. "You took the 15 million. You have to give it back if you are not selling." This is where Benjamin Foster stepped forward, opening his leather briefcase with a satisfying click. "Actually, Mr. Caldwell," Benjamin said, his tone dripping with professional satisfaction, "my client does not have to give you a single dime. The $15 million you wired this afternoon has been legally frozen by a federal judge. We filed an emergency injunction the moment the funds hit the escrow account." Jason stared at the lawyer, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Frozen? Why? You cannot do that. That is theft." Benjamin smiled a cold, predatory expression. "It is not theft. Mr. Caldwell, it is restitution. You forged a medical proxy to steal $5 million from your father. We have documented proof of the unauthorized wire transfers." The judge immediately froze the $15 million to cover the stolen retirement funds, plus massive punitive damages for severe elderly financial abuse, grand larceny, and corporate fraud. "We are going to drain every single penny of that frozen account through civil litigation. You handed us the exact weapon we needed to destroy you." The absolute reality of his ruin finally crashed down on Jason. He had no land, he had no resort. The money he had squeezed from his mother's accounts, the money from the stolen Seattle estate, and the incredibly dangerous cash he had borrowed from the underground loan sharks was all gone. It was locked away in a federal vault, completely out of his reach. He was going to owe millions to violent criminals, and he had absolutely no way to pay them back. "Dad, please." Jason dropped to his knees right there on the hardwood floor, his designer suit wrinkling awkwardly. Tears streamed down his face. "You cannot do this to me. I will be killed. You have to give the money back. I am your son. You ceased being my son the moment you locked me out in the rain." I replied coldly, staring down at him without a single ounce of mercy. Suddenly, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open once more. Two men in dark windbreakers stepped into the room. Their expressions grim and strictly professional. The letters FBI were printed boldly in bright yellow across their backs. Benjamin Foster had not just filed a civil lawsuit. He had handed over the entire dossier of Jason's fabricated financial reports, the commingled stolen funds, and the fraudulent investor records directly to the federal authorities. Jason Caldwell, the lead agent, announced, pulling out heavy steel handcuffs. "Stand up." The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs, echoing in that silent glass boardroom, was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Jason tried to pull his arms away, but the federal agents were devoid of patience. They yanked him up, twisting his arms behind his back. He did not look like a tycoon anymore. He looked like a terrified, broken little boy, who had finally been caught stealing from the cookie jar. He looked back at me over his shoulder as they marched him toward the heavy glass doors, his face stained with tears, pleading for a rescue that was never going to come. I did not blink. I did not flinch. She crawled forward, reaching out with trembling hands to grab the hem of my trousers. "Harrison," she sobbed, her voice a pathetic, high-pitched wail that echoed off the cold glass walls. "Please, Harrison, you cannot do this to us. You cannot let them take our boy away. I am so sorry. I was foolish. I was confused. We have been married for 50 years, 50 years of history, of building a family together. You cannot just erase all of that. Please, look at me. Look at your wife. Have mercy on us." I looked down at the woman who had shared my bed, eaten at my table, and smiled in my face while secretly plotting my absolute ruin. I felt nothing. The love I once had for her had been completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, impenetrable ash. I stepped back, forcing her to release her desperate grip on my suit. I adjusted my jacket and looked down at her tear-stained face. "You divorced a broke old man in the rain, Martha," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or forgiveness. "The man standing here does not know you." I turned my back on her and walked out of the boardroom. Benjamin Foster followed behind me, leaving Martha and Rachel alone to face the absolute devastation they had brought upon themselves. I walked out of the downtown financial tower, stepped into the private car, and told the driver to take me straight back to the airfield. I was finally going home. The aftermath of that afternoon was swift and brutal. Benjamin kept me updated on the legal bloodbath over the next few months. Jason was denied bail. The federal prosecutors used the frozen $15 million as the cornerstone of their massive fraud case. I walked past the purebred puppies and found two old battered rescue dogs, who had been abandoned by their previous owners. They were cautious, scarred, and tired. I knew exactly how they felt. I adopted them both on the spot. They now spend their days sleeping in front of the massive river rock fireplace, completely safe and fiercely loyal. I did not just keep the wealth to myself. With Benjamin's help, I established a foundation dedicated to providing aggressive legal representation for victims of elderly financial abuse. I used the recovered money to hire a team of ruthless attorneys who hunt down predatory relatives and corrupt caretakers.